Blythe Calderon woke at 4 a.m. to the sound of her sister drowning on dry land. The cough came wet and rattled from the corner where Thea's hospital bed crowded their East Oakland studio, each hack pulling blood into the cloth pressed against 16-year-old lips. The water-stained ceiling above seemed to press down like the weight of $67,000 in medical debt they would never escape. Insurance lapsed 3 months ago, when Blythe's temp contract ended without renewal. She crossed the cramped space in 4 steps, steel-toe boots already laced because sleep never came deep enough to bother removing them. Thea's gray eyes found hers through the dim light filtering past ancient blinds, and Blythe saw the question her sister couldn't ask between gasps. Will we make it through another week? The answer sat on the counter. A single work order for tonight. Voss Logistics Corporate Gala at the Port of Oakland Event Center. Equipment coordinator. 12-hour shift. $400 cash. Enough for 2 weeks of Thea's medications if she rationed the breathing treatments, stretched the antibiotics, prayed the cystic fibrosis didn't advance faster than their ability to pay for it. Blythe helped her sister sit up, adjusted the oxygen line with hands that had learned to be gentle through 7 years of necessity. I've got work tonight, she said, her voice steady despite everything. Good money. Enough to keep you breathing. Thea managed a weak smile, then signed with trembling fingers. Be careful. Corporate people don't see us. The warning settled in Blythe's chest like a stone. Her little sister, 16 and dying by degrees, understood the world better than most adults. To the executives and logistics partners who would fill that venue tonight, Blythe would be invisible. Just another temp worker in an oversized utility jacket. Her ID badge flipped backward, because she'd learned that hiding her name meant fewer questions, fewer chances to be blamed when something went wrong in systems she didn't design. She would be wallpaper. She would coordinate equipment. She would collect her $400 and come home before dawn to count out pills and breathing treatments like a miser counting gold. What Blythe didn't know, what she couldn't know as she pressed a kiss to her sister's forehead and promised to bring something home, was that tonight, she would do something no invisible person was ever supposed to do. Tonight she would interrupt the machinery of corporate power. Tonight she would shove the most dangerous man on the West Coast. And nothing would ever be invisible about her again. Before we continue, like this video, if you've ever felt invisible in a world that only sees credentials and titles. Share it with someone who needs to hear that courage doesn't require permission. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens when one temp worker sees the truth everyone else is paid to ignore. Because tonight, the empire built on efficiency is about to learn that the people it overlooks are the ones who see everything. Chapter 1. The coughing started at 4:17 a.m., pulling Blythe from the kind of shallow sleep that never quite qualified as rest. Not a normal cough. This was wet, rattling, the sound of lungs trying to expel what they couldn't process. She was out of bed before consciousness fully caught up, her bare feet hitting the cold linoleum of their East Oakland studio apartment, navigating by muscle memory past the nebulizer machine, the oxygen concentrator, the small pharmacy of medications crowding every available surface. Thea sat upright on the futon they shared, her 16-year-old body hunched forward, a stained cloth pressed to her mouth. When she pulled it away, Blythe saw what she'd been dreading. Bright red blood against white fabric, more than yesterday, more than last week, the cystic fibrosis advancing with the patient inevitability of a debt coming due. I'm okay, Thea whispered, but her voice was threadbare, her eyes wide with the terror that came from feeling your own body betray you. It's just the weather changing. Dry air. I'm okay. Blythe didn't argue. She grabbed a clean towel, helped her sister through the breathing treatment that was supposed to happen at 6 a.m. but couldn't wait now, and tried not to calculate how many more mornings like this they had left, before the decision between medication and rent became the decision between medication and existence. The studio apartment told their story in water stains and peeling paint. 1,100 square feet on the 3rd floor of a building, where the elevator worked, maybe twice a week, and the ancient gas heater coughed almost as badly as Thea did. Medical equipment dominated the space. The nebulizer that cost $800 they couldn't afford. The pulse oximeter that tracked oxygen saturation. The dozens of pill bottles arranged by dosage and time of day like a pharmacological filing system. The kitchen was 3 feet of counter space and a hot plate. The bathroom had mold in the grout that Blythe scrubbed every weekend but could never quite defeat. And everywhere, the bills, the collection notices, the past due warnings printed in increasingly aggressive fonts. $67,000 in medical debt. $4,200 past due on treatments from 3 months ago, when Thea had pneumonia and spent 11 days in the ICU. Insurance that had lapsed because the monthly premium doubled, and Blythe had to choose between coverage and eating. The pulmonologist who sent stern letters about lack of compliance with payment arrangements, as if poverty was a moral failing instead of mathematical inevitability. Blythe made instant coffee, the cheap kind that tasted like burnt regret, and stared at the work order on her phone. Tonight's assignment: equipment coordinator for Voss Logistics annual gala at the Port of Oakland Event Center. 12-hour shift starting at 2 p.m. $400 flat rate. Cash payment at completion. No taxes withheld because temp agencies didn't worry about things like W-2s or worker protections. $400. 2 weeks of Thea's medications. Or 3 weeks of food. Or a month of keeping the lights on. Or approximately 0.6% of the total debt that was crushing them both like the weight of a collapsed building. You don't have to go, Thea said quietly. She'd finished her treatment, and was lying back against pillows that had been doubled to help her breathe easier. We can manage another week. I can ask the school nurse about the patient assistance program again. The program has a 6-month waiting list, and requires insurance we don't have. Blythe kept her voice gentle despite the rage simmering beneath every word. I'm going. It's one night. 12 hours of equipment coordination. I've done it 100 times. For Voss Logistics though. Thea's expression was complicated. Part worry, part something darker. That's the scholarship program you applied for, right? The one that rejected you? Blythe had tried not to think about that. 3 years ago, when she still believed hard work and competence could overcome circumstances, she'd applied for the Voss Logistics Technical Scholarship, full tuition for working-class students pursuing careers in logistics and supply chain management. She'd written essays about growing up in Oakland, about understanding the machinery of ports and warehouses from the ground level, about wanting to make systems work better for the people who operated them. The rejection letter had been polite and impersonal. While we appreciate your application, we have determined that your profile does not demonstrate the leadership potential we seek in scholarship recipients. Leadership potential. As if coordinating logistics for temp agencies while raising a chronically ill sister and surviving on $28,000 a year wasn't leadership. As if making impossible choices every single day wasn't the truest test of competence that existed. It's fine, Blythe said, because anger wouldn't pay for pulmonary therapy, and resentment wouldn't cure cystic fibrosis. I'll stay invisible, do the work, collect the money. Corporate people don't even see temp workers. We're furniture that occasionally moves equipment. Thea reached out and grabbed her hand. Be careful, Blythe. Those corporate people, they don't see us as human. They see us as costs to be minimized. Don't let them make you complicit in something that compromises who you are. I'm coordinating lighting placement, not laundering money. But Blythe squeezed her sister's hand back, grateful for the warning, even as she dismissed it. I'll be home by 3 a.m. Call me if anything changes. She arrived at the Port of Oakland Event Center at 1:47 p.m. Her steel-toe boots, required safety equipment that had cost 2 weeks of food budget, scuffed from years of warehouse floors and loading docks. The venue was stunning in the way corporate excess always was. 30,000 square feet of polished concrete that reflected recessed lighting like a mirror, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the port where container ships moved with the patience of sleeping giants, minimalist stage design that probably cost more than Blythe would earn in 5 years. The production coordinator handed her a clipboard and a radio, main stage equipment, lighting truss, microphone placement, cable management. You've done this before? 100 times. Blythe clipped the radio to her belt and tried not to look at the catering setup being arranged near the entrance. Tables loaded with food that would be discarded after the event. Seared salmon, truffle risotto, artisan desserts arranged like edible architecture. A single plate worth more than Thea's weekly medication costs. Hundreds of dollars of waste while her sister rationed breathing treatments because refills were expensive. The rage burned in her chest, hot and acidic. She swallowed it. Anger wouldn't pay for pulmonary therapy. Anger wouldn't cure cystic fibrosis. Anger would only cost her the $400 that meant 2 more weeks of keeping Thea alive. Invisible people don't get to have opinions about lighting placement, she muttered to herself, pulling on work gloves and heading toward the main stage. The stage itself was a masterpiece of engineering, modular construction, integrated AV systems, lighting truss capable of supporting half a ton of equipment. Blythe checked the rigging points, the cable runs, the microphone placement that would carry Harlan Voss's keynote speech to 300 corporate executives and logistics partners who'd paid $500 per plate to be here. Harlan Voss. The name alone carried weight in West Coast logistics. CEO who'd built an empire from a single port contract, now controlling 40% of container traffic from Seattle to San Diego. The business magazines called him visionary. The industry journals called him ruthless. The workers who loaded his ships probably had other names, but those didn't make it into corporate press releases. Blythe had seen his face before, on the rejection letter for the scholarship, on the About Us page of the Voss Logistics website, in the business section profiles that treated billionaire CEOs like they were explorers instead of exploiters. Steel blue eyes, disciplined posture, the kind of face that looked carved rather than born. The face of someone who'd never had to choose between medication and rent, between eating and electricity, between survival and dignity. She checked her assignment list: lighting truss inspection, cable management, microphone placement, technical equipment coordination. 12 hours of being invisible in a room full of people who wouldn't remember her face 5 minutes after she left. 12 hours of watching corporate excess while her sister struggled to breathe in a studio apartment with water-stained ceilings. 12 hours that would pay for 2 weeks of medication. "You look angry." Blythe turned. A woman in her mid-30s stood near the stage steps, auburn haircut with geometric precision, tailored pantsuit that probably cost more than Blythe's entire wardrobe. Her expression was cool, assessing, the look of someone evaluating equipment functionality rather than greeting a human being. "Just focused," Blythe said carefully, making sure everything's secure for the keynote. "Good. This is a professional event, not a warehouse. I expect precision." The woman's eyes scanned the cable runs with the intensity of an auditor looking for fraud. Visible cables are unacceptable. Sloppy rigging reflects poorly on the organization. "Fix it." She walked away before Blythe could respond, heels clicking against polished concrete with metronomic authority. Blythe looked at the cables. They were already secured exactly to industry standard, tucked and tied with professional efficiency. There was nothing to fix. The criticism wasn't about actual problems. It was about establishing hierarchy, about reminding the temp worker that her expertise didn't matter, her competence was assumed inadequate, her presence was tolerated rather than valued. "Invisible people," Blythe whispered to the empty stage, "don't get to have opinions about lighting placement." She pulled the cables tighter anyway, because pride didn't pay for medication, and arguing with corporate authority only got you fired. She checked the lighting truss overhead, massive steel framework supporting hundreds of pounds of intelligent lighting, moving heads, LED arrays that could create any atmosphere the production designer desired. And she noticed something that made her breath catch. The anchor bolts weren't seated properly. Not all of them, just enough to matter. Just enough that under sustained load, under the stress of operation, the connection points would begin to separate. She checked the inspection log clipped to the rigging frame. Dalton Cruz, site supervisor. Structural inspection completed 8:30. All systems secure, but the bolts were loose. And the support cables showed slight fraying that looked wrong, not the natural wear of use, but the deliberate marking of something compromised. Blythe's temp worker survival instinct screamed a warning. "Report this, and you'll be blamed for it. Stay quiet, and collect your money. You're invisible. Act like it." But her sister's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't let them make you complicit in something that compromises who you are." She pulled out her phone to photograph the rigging, to document what she was seeing, to create evidence that someone else had missed this during the official inspection. That's when she heard the voice from the equipment storage area behind the stage. Clear, controlled, unmistakably the same woman who'd criticized her cable management minutes earlier. "Tonight ends the Voss problem. The structure will fail during closing remarks. Investigation will show negligence, overloaded truss, missed inspection." Dalton signed off on everything. No fingerprints, no evidence. Just a tragic accident. Blythe froze, her hand still holding the phone, her mind trying to process what she just overheard. And in that moment, being invisible stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like complicity in something she couldn't unsee. Chapter 2. Blythe retreated from the equipment storage area, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. The woman's voice, controlled, methodical, discussing murder like it was a logistics problem to be solved, echoed in her head with the clarity of something that couldn't be unheard. Tonight ends the Voss problem. The structure will fail during closing remarks. She forced herself to keep moving, to look busy, to be invisible. Her hands shook as she adjusted cable ties that didn't need adjusting, checked rigging points she'd already inspected, anything to appear occupied while her mind tried to process what she'd just overheard. The woman emerged from the storage area 30 seconds later, phone tucked away, her expression perfectly composed. She walked past Blythe without acknowledgement, as if temp workers were furniture that occasionally required rearranging, but never warranted actual attention. Blythe watched her go, noting everything with the sharp focus of someone whose survival had always depended on reading danger before it arrived. Mid-30s, auburn haircut with geometric precision, not a strand out of place, tailored charcoal pantsuit that probably cost 3 months of Blythe's rent. But it was the eyes that told the real story. Cold calculation, the look of someone who saw people as variables in equations, obstacles to be managed or eliminated. "That's Maria Klein." The voice came from beside her, another equipment coordinator, older guy with a tool belt, and the resigned expression of someone who'd worked too many corporate events. Head of operations. Been with Voss Logistics for 10 years, runs a tight ship, by which I mean she'll fire you for breathing wrong. She seems efficient, Blythe managed, the word tasting like ash in her mouth, because efficient was how you described someone who planned structural failures With the same tone, most people used to order coffee. Efficient like an industrial shredder, he adjusted his radio volume. Just stay out of her way and you'll be fine. Sound check starts in 20. You're on microphone placement? Blythe nodded, not trusting her voice. Her mind was still circling the overheard conversation, trying to find an interpretation that didn't end in corporate assassination. Investigation shows negligence. Dalton signed off on everything. No fingerprints. Premeditated. Calculated. And she was the only person who knew. The survival instinct that had kept her and Thea alive through 7 years of poverty screamed at her. Stay quiet. Collect your $400. Go home. This isn't your problem. Getting involved will only destroy you. But the loosened bolts overhead weren't theoretical. The fraying cables weren't abstract. And closing remarks meant someone was going to die in approximately 4 hours. Harlan Voss arrived for soundcheck at 4:47 p.m., and Blythe understood immediately why people used words like commanding and authoritative in business profiles. He moved through the venue like he owned the molecular structure of the air itself. Not arrogant, just absolutely certain of his place in any space he occupied. Steel blue eyes scanned the room with the systematic efficiency of someone used to identifying problems before they became crises. Disciplined posture, tailored suit that managed to look both expensive and practical. The kind of face that business magazines loved because it photographed well in leadership contexts. Blythe was adjusting the microphone stand center stage when he approached. She kept her eyes down, expecting dismissal or, at best, instructions delivered without eye contact, the way most executives communicated with people they considered service personnel. Instead, he stopped, looked at her. Actually looked at her. You're not the usual AV contractor, he said. Not accusatory. Observational, like he was noting a data point that didn't match his expected pattern. Blythe's hand froze on the microphone adjustment. Temp coordinator. Just for tonight. Making sure everything's positioned correctly for your keynote. Temp coordinator. He repeated it like he was testing the phrase for accuracy. Then his gaze dropped to her steel-toe boots. Scuffed. Practical. Marked by years of actual work rather than corporate theater. You look like someone who knows how things actually work, not just how they're supposed to look on paper. She didn't know how to respond to that. Corporate executives didn't usually distinguish between working and looking like work. They certainly didn't compliment temp workers on their boots. Voss stepped onto the stage, testing the microphone placement with the precise movements of someone who'd given 1,000 speeches. But then he stopped, looked up at the lighting truss overhead, and frowned slightly. Does this setup feel stable to you? The question hit Blythe like an electrical shock. He was asking her professional opinion. Actually asking. Not testing her, not patronizing her. Genuinely wanting to know what someone who worked with equipment every day thought about the structural integrity of a system that would be supporting his life in a few hours. She started, then stopped. Because the honest answer was no, the anchor bolts are loose and the cables are fraying, and someone deliberately sabotaged this rigging to fail during your closing remarks. But saying that would require explaining how she knew. Would require admitting she'd overheard something she wasn't supposed to hear. Would require inserting herself into corporate drama that could destroy her chances at the $400 that meant Thea's medication. Voss waited, his expression patient, but genuinely interested. I'm asking because you're the person who actually handles this equipment. The inspection reports say everything's fine, but inspection reports are written by people who need to show everything's fine. I'd rather hear from someone whose job depends on things actually being stable. And there it was, the impossible choice crystallizing in real time. She could stay quiet, stay invisible, collect her money. Or she could tell the truth to a man who was asking for it, knowing it would cost her everything. The truss feels off, she said carefully, each word weighted with consequences she couldn't fully calculate. The anchor bolts aren't seated properly. I noticed it during setup, and the support cables show stress marks that don't match normal wear patterns. Voss's expression sharpened. Show me. They crossed to the rigging access point, and Blythe pointed out the details she'd documented mentally. The bolts that were loose by maybe 2 rotations, not enough to be obvious, but enough to matter under sustained load. The cables with fraying that looked too uniform, too deliberate. The inspection log says Dalton Cruz cleared this at 8:30 this morning, Voss said, pulling out his phone and photographing what she'd shown him. You're telling me these issues weren't present then, or that he missed them? I'm telling you they're here now, Blythe said, which was technically true without being complete truth, and that if I were responsible for this setup, I'd want a second inspection before putting any weight on it. Voss studied her for a long moment, and Blythe felt the full weight of being seen, not as furniture or obstacle or invisible temp worker, but as a human being with expertise that mattered. What's your name? Blythe. Blythe Calderon. Thank you, Blythe. He gestured to someone off stage, a security contractor who approached with the alert posture of someone used to handling problems. Get structural engineering down here. Full inspection of the rigging before we let anyone in the venue. And find Dalton Cruz. I want to know why he signed off on equipment that's showing stress indicators." The security contractor nodded and moved away with purpose. Voss turned back to Blythe. "You just saved me from giving a keynote under compromised equipment. That's the kind of observation that matters, more than any credential." Then he walked away to handle whatever executives handled, leaving Blythe standing alone on the stage, her survival instinct screaming that she'd just made herself visible in ways that couldn't be undone. And somewhere in the venue, Mireya Klein was realizing her carefully planned accident had just been exposed by a temp worker who wasn't supposed to matter at all. Chapter 3. The structural engineers arrived 40 minutes later, 2 men in hard hats carrying equipment that looked expensive and purposeful. Blythe watched from stage left as they examined the rigging with systematic precision, their faces growing progressively more grim as they documented what they found. She should have felt relieved. She'd reported the problem. Voss had taken her seriously. The right people were investigating. She could stay invisible now, let the professionals handle it, collect her $400 and go home to Thea. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking, because she knew something the engineers were still discovering. She knew this wasn't neglect, or accident, or oversight. She knew someone had deliberately sabotaged this equipment, had planned it with the cold precision of someone who'd spent 10 years positioning pieces on a chessboard, waiting for the exact right moment to execute a move disguised as tragedy. 10 years of positioning. Tonight, the board transfers control through proxy votes. The words kept circling in her mind, each repetition adding weight to the realization that she hadn't just witnessed a threat. She'd witnessed the final stage of a corporate coup, where murder was filed under strategic transition. "Ms. Calderon?" One of the engineers approached, his expression carefully neutral, in the way of professionals delivering bad news. "Can you show us exactly what you observed during your setup inspection?" Blythe led them through it again, pointing out the anchor bolts that were loosened by approximately 2 rotations each, the support cables that showed uniform stress fracturing along their length, the safety redundancy bypasses that required access codes, and deliberate manipulation. "This wasn't missed during inspection," the senior engineer said quietly, photographing everything with methodical precision. "This was done after inspection, probably within the last few hours." His partner was examining the cable ends with a specialized tool, measuring something Blythe couldn't identify. "These aren't fraying from stress or wear. These are cuts. Precision cuts. Someone used industrial cable shears, went to about 70% depth on 3 primary support cables." He looked up, his professional composure cracking slightly. "That's not equipment failure. That's deliberate sabotage designed to fail under sustained load at a specific threshold. 70%. Blythe's mind did the horrible mathematics. Enough structural integrity to pass casual observation. Enough compromise to guarantee catastrophic failure once weight and stress reached critical levels. Which would happen approximately 45 minutes into a keynote speech, when the lighting truss was fully operational and the stage was occupied. During closing remarks, exactly as Mireya had said. "You're sure?" The security contractor, she'd heard someone call him Rook, had joined them, his expression hard and focused. "You're telling me someone deliberately sabotaged equipment that would have been directly above Mr. Voss during his keynote? I'm telling you that if this had gone operational as planned, the truss would have failed catastrophically. Half a ton of steel and lighting equipment would have fallen approximately 15 feet onto whoever was center stage." The engineer's voice was flat, clinical, but his hands were unsteady as he documented measurements. "And the failure would have looked like negligence, overloaded truss, missed inspection, tragic accident. Except it's not an accident. If someone cut the cables to 70% depth and loosened the anchor bolts to precise tolerances." Rook pulled out his phone, already dialing. "We need to shut this down, evacuate the venue, call SFPD. Get forensics." "Wait." Blythe's voice surprised her with its steadiness, despite the adrenaline making her hands shake. "Check the inspection log. Check who signed off on this rigging at 8:30 this morning." The engineer pulled up the digital log on his tablet. "Dalton Cruz, site supervisor, certification current, no violations on record. Inspection completed 8:30, all systems marked secure." He frowned. "But timestamp analysis shows this is wrong. The report was created at 15:47. That's almost 4 hours after the listed inspection time. Someone backdated this. So Dalton either falsified the inspection, or someone used his credentials to file a fraudulent report." Rook's expression had gone from concerned to coldly furious. "Either way, this is premeditated. This is planned." Blythe watched them piece together what she already knew, watched the professional investigators arrive at conclusions she'd reached, the moment she heard Mireya's controlled voice, discussing structural failure like it was a PowerPoint presentation. Part of her wanted to tell them everything, the overheard conversation, the specific phrasing about no fingerprints, and proxy votes, and 10 years of positioning. But telling them meant admitting she'd been in a restricted area, meant revealing she'd heard something she wasn't supposed to hear, meant transforming herself from helpful temp worker who noticed a problem into someone who'd been surveilling executives, meant losing the invisibility that had kept her safe for 7 years. Ms. Calderon. Voss's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. He'd returned with more security personnel, his expression grave but controlled. The engineers tell me you identified structural compromise that would have resulted in catastrophic failure. That you noticed details our certified inspector apparently missed, or deliberately concealed. I work with equipment every day. I know what normal stress patterns look like. Blythe kept her voice carefully neutral, trying to stay in the safe territory of technical observation rather than conspiracy revelation. Those cables weren't normal. The anchor bolts weren't normal. It felt wrong. It felt wrong, because it was deliberately made wrong. Voss studied her with an intensity that made her want to step back. You saved my life. You understand that? If this event had proceeded as scheduled, I would have been standing directly under that truss when it failed. I would be dead, and the investigation would have concluded it was negligence, oversight, tragic accident. Sir, we need to consider who had access to this rigging after the initial inspection. Rook had his security tablet out, pulling up digital logs, access codes, personnel movements, anyone who approached this area between 8:30 and 1500. Pull everything, Voss ordered. Video surveillance, access logs, personnel records. And find Dalton Cruz. I want to know who paid him to falsify that inspection report. As they dispersed to handle the investigation, Maria Klein appeared at the edge of the stage area. Her expression was perfectly composed, concern without panic, interest without anxiety. But Blythe saw something flicker behind her eyes when she noticed the engineers documenting the sabotaged rigging, saw the microscopic tension in her jaw when Voss mentioned pulling surveillance footage. Harlan, what's happening? Maria's voice carried exactly the right note of professional worry. I'm hearing something about structural concerns. Someone sabotaged the rigging, Voss said bluntly. Deliberately cut support cables, loosened anchor bolts, falsified inspection reports. If we'd proceeded with the keynote as planned, the lighting truss would have fallen during my closing remarks. My God. Maria's hand went to her throat in what looked like genuine shock. Who would do something like that? Do we know if this was targeted or random vandalism? Too precise to be random. Too calculated to be vandalism. Voss gestured to the engineer's documentation. This was planned by someone who understood structural engineering, who had access to industrial equipment, who knew exactly when and how to compromise the system for maximum impact. Maria's eyes drifted to Blythe. Just for a second, just long enough for Blythe to see the calculation happening behind that perfectly composed expression. The temp worker who'd noticed what she shouldn't have noticed. The invisible person who'd suddenly become very visible at exactly the wrong moment. Well, Mireya said softly, thank God someone caught it before tragedy occurred. We'll need to review all our safety protocols, obviously. Determine how this happened. Ensure it never happens again. She smiled at Blythe. Warm, grateful, absolutely terrifying. You're the equipment coordinator who identified the problem. Thank you. You potentially saved lives tonight. Then she walked away, heels clicking against polished concrete with the same metronomic precision as before, as if she hadn't just been confronted with evidence that her carefully planned assassination had been exposed by the one person in the venue she'd considered too insignificant to matter. Blythe stood frozen, watching her go, understanding with crystalline clarity that staying invisible was no longer an option. She'd saved Harlan Voss's life. She'd exposed a murder plot, disguised as negligence. She'd become a threat to someone who'd spent 10 years positioning for this exact moment. And now that someone knew her face, knew her name, and would absolutely try to eliminate the only witness who could destroy everything, the $400 suddenly didn't matter at all. Chapter 4. The venue reopened 4 hours late. New rigging. Triple inspected by 3 independent structural engineers. Security so tight that Blythe watched Rook's team check credentials like they were guarding nuclear launch codes. And a tension in the air that came from everyone knowing that something catastrophic had almost happened, but not quite understanding what. The official story was vague. Equipment malfunction discovered during pre-event inspection. Venue temporarily closed as precaution. No danger to attendees. Corporate messaging at its finest. Acknowledged something happened without actually saying what. Blythe stood stage left with her equipment checklist, her radio, and the knowledge that she was the only person in this room who understood exactly how close tonight had come to murder, disguised as negligence. Voss had personally asked her to stay. I need someone I can trust monitoring the technical setup. Someone who actually sees what's happening, instead of what the paperwork says is happening. He'd looked at her with an intensity that made her understand why people followed him. You saved my life today. I'm asking you to stay and help me make sure it stays saved. So she stayed, even though every survival instinct screamed that being this visible was dangerous, even though Thea had texted twice asking if she was okay, even though the $400 had transformed from critical necessity into blood money for witnessing something she wasn't supposed to see. 300 corporate executives and logistics partners filed into the venue. Men and women in suits that cost more than Blythe's annual income, wearing watches worth more than Thea's lifetime medical expenses, discussing deals and markets and efficiency metrics, while Blythe watched new rigging that hadn't been sabotaged and tried not to think about what almost was. Mireya Klein circulated through the crowd with perfect poise, her expression warm and engaged, playing the role of competent executive managing a minor crisis with grace. But twice Blythe caught her looking at the new rigging overhead, her mouth tight with something that looked like frustration barely contained. 10 years of positioning. The phrase kept echoing in Blythe's mind. 10 years of building something, planning something, executing every detail perfectly, until a temp worker noticed loosened bolts and ruined everything. The lights dimmed. The venue quieted. Harlan Voss took the stage to applause that felt more relieved than celebratory, as if everyone knew something had gone wrong but was grateful the problem had been handled before it became tragedy. "Good evening," Voss began, his voice steady and commanding. "Thank you for your patience during our extended setup. I'm told it's unusual to triple-check structural integrity, but I've learned tonight that unusual precautions can prevent usual disasters." Polite laughter. Blythe watched the new rigging overhead, tracking every bolt, every cable, every stress point, with the focus of someone who understood that vigilance was the only thing standing between order and catastrophe. "Tonight, I want to talk about the future of logistics," Voss continued, moving center stage with the confidence of someone who'd given this speech 100 times. "And that future isn't just about efficiency, or profit margins, or technological innovation. It's about accountability." Blythe's radio crackled. Rook's voice, quiet and controlled. "All stations. Maintain observation protocols. Elevated security level through closing remarks." Because closing remarks was when the original rigging would have failed, when half a ton of steel and lighting would have crashed onto the stage, killing Voss and making it look like the tragic consequence of overlooked maintenance. Blythe's eyes moved from the new rigging to Mireya, who stood near the front row watching Voss with an expression of polite attention that didn't quite reach her eyes. And Blythe understood with cold certainty. The sabotage had been discovered, the murder prevented, but Mireya's plan hadn't been defeated, just delayed. The board transfers control through proxy votes. Whatever endgame Mireya had spent 10 years building, it required Voss's death. And now that the careful, undetectable method had failed, what would the desperate method look like? Accountability means trusting the people who do the work, not just the paperwork that says work was done, Voss was saying, and Blythe felt the terrible irony of watching a CEO preach ground-level wisdom while standing alive, only because a temp worker had trusted her expertise over official inspection logs. The speech continued. 15 minutes about supply chain ethics, corporate responsibility, the moral obligation of logistics leaders to value human knowledge over systemic efficiency. Blythe monitored equipment, tracked the rigging, and tried to ignore the growing certainty that something was wrong. Not with the equipment. The new rigging was perfect. But with Mireya, who'd been on her phone for the last 3 minutes, typing with the focused intensity of someone issuing instructions rather than checking messages. Who'd moved from the front row toward the emergency exit near the stage. Who kept glancing at her watch like she was counting down to something. Voss reached his closing remarks. And that accountability starts not with systems or policies, but with the courage to listen when someone who knows the truth tells you something you don't want to hear. "Tonight I'm alive because a temp worker trusted her expertise over my inspection reports. That's the kind of accountability our industry needs." Blythe saw it happen in fractional seconds that felt like slow-motion disaster. The emergency exit door opening. A figure entering Dalton Cruz, the site supervisor who'd signed the falsified inspection report. His hand reaching into his jacket, pulling something metallic that caught the stage lights. A gun. Not complex, not subtle, just brutal, direct elimination when the careful plan failed. Blythe didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't weigh consequences against $400 or Thea's medication or her own survival. She ran, full sprint across the stage while 300 people watched, while Rook's security team was still processing the threat, while Dalton's arm was rising to aim at Voss who stood center stage completely exposed. She hit Voss with both hands, full body weight, tackling him sideways with enough force that they both crashed into the podium in a tangle of limbs and shattering microphone stands. The gunshot cracked through the venue like thunder, the round passing through the space where Voss's head had been 1 second earlier, embedding in the backdrop behind the stage. Then chaos, screaming, people diving under tables, security swarming. Rook's team taking down Dalton with the practiced efficiency of professionals who'd trained for exactly this scenario. More gunshots, warning shots, controlled shots, the sound of a threat being neutralized. and Blythe on the stage floor with Voss, her ears ringing, her hands shaking, her mind blank except for the repeating thought, I just saved his life again. I just made myself visible in ways I can never undo. Rook hauled her to her feet, his grip professional but not gentle. Are you hurt, Miss Calderon? Are you injured? She shook her head, unable to form words, watching, as more security dragged Dalton out while he screamed, 50,000! She promised me, 50,000, at anyone who would listen. Voss stood slowly, his suit torn, his expression shocked but controlled. He looked at Blythe, then at the bullet hole in the backdrop, then back at Blythe. You knew, he said quietly. You knew something was still wrong. I saw Mireya on her phone. Saw Dalton at the emergency exit. Blythe's voice sounded distant in her own ears, muffled by adrenaline and ringing gunshot aftermath. I didn't think. I couldn't let. Get her to security office, Voss ordered Rook, protective custody. And find Mireya Klein, now. But Mireya was already gone. Emergency exit, standing open, phone abandoned on the floor, and Blythe, the invisible temp worker who'd just prevented 2 murder attempts in one night, finally understanding that some choices couldn't be undone, and some visibility was permanent, whether you wanted it or not. The $400 didn't matter anymore. Staying invisible was impossible. And somewhere in the venue's chaos, Thea's medication still needed to be paid for, while Blythe tried to figure out how to survive being the witness who'd ruined a 10-year plan built on patient positioning and calculated murder. Chapter 5. The security office smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaning solution. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, with the persistent buzz of failing ballasts, casting everything in the kind of harsh illumination that made everyone look guilty of something. Blythe sat in a metal chair bolted to the concrete floor, her wrists zip-tied in front of her, her work radio and equipment checklist confiscated, her phone sitting on the interrogation table just out of reach. Behind one-way glass, she knew people were watching, evaluating, deciding what narrative would be easiest to sell. Rook Ellison stood across from her, arms crossed, his expression professionally neutral in the way of security contractors who'd perfected the art of intimidation through stillness. Let me make sure I understand the sequence of events. You, a temp worker on her first night at this venue, somehow determined that rigging inspected and approved by a certified site supervisor was structurally compromised. You then convinced Mr. Voss to delay the event for 4 hours while new equipment was installed. And tonight when the keynote finally proceeded, you physically tackled a CEO in front of 300 witnesses, claiming you saw a threat no one else identified. That's what happened, Blythe said, her voice steadier than she felt. Dalton had a gun. He was going to shoot Voss. I stopped it. You stopped it. Rook pulled out a tablet, swiped through something. Or you created it. Because from where I'm standing, this looks like corporate sabotage. Original rigging gets flagged, event gets delayed, security protocols get disrupted, and then conveniently, you're the hero who tackles the CEO at exactly the moment gunshots happen. 2 corporate investigators flanked him, a woman in her 50s with the severe expression of someone who'd spent too many years hunting fraud, and a younger man whose designer glasses and tailored suit screamed Ivy League legal training. They'd introduced themselves with titles Blythe hadn't processed, her mind still ringing with gunshot aftermath, and the memory of Voss's weight crashing into her as they hit the stage floor. This is corporate sabotage, the woman said flatly. The question is who hired you, and what they're paying you to disrupt Voss logistics operations. No one hired me. I'm a temp coordinator making $400 for 12 hours of equipment setup. Blythe leaned forward as much as the zip ties allowed. I didn't sabotage anything. I saved him, twice. First from rigging that was deliberately compromised, then from Dalton who was paid to shoot him when the first method failed. You're claiming deliberate structural failure, followed by assassination attempt. Rook's voice carried skepticism so thick, it felt like a physical barrier. Do you understand how that sounds? How paranoid and calculated that narrative is? I understand it sounds insane. I understand it makes me look like either a conspirator or someone having a breakdown. Blythe met his eyes, refusing to look away. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. What you heard. The legal investigator pulled out his own tablet. Walk us through that again. So Blythe did, forcing herself to stay calm, to recite the facts without emotion, even though every word felt like a confession to crimes she hadn't committed. The overheard phone call. Mireya's controlled voice discussing structural failure during closing remarks, Dalton signing off on falsified inspections, 10 years of positioning, proxy votes transferring board control, the precise phrasing about no fingerprints and tragic accident that meant this wasn't negligence but premeditated murder disguised as corporate oversight. The investigators exchanged glances. Blythe saw it, The silent communication that said she sounds articulate and detailed, which makes this either truth or very sophisticated deception, and we don't have enough information to tell which. You expect us to believe, the woman said carefully, that Mireya Klein, head of operations, trusted executive for 10 years, planned to assassinate her own CEO through sabotaged rigging and hired shooters? I expect you to check the evidence. The rigging logs. The access codes. Who had opportunity to cut those cables and loosen those bolts after the original inspection? Blythe's voice rose, despite her efforts to stay controlled. I expect you to ask why Dalton was screaming about $50,000 when your team took him down. I expect you to trace where that money came from. The office door opened. Mireya Klein entered with the smooth confidence of someone who belonged in every room she entered, her expression perfectly calibrated between concern and professional composure. How is she? Mireya asked Rook, as if Blythe wasn't sitting right there, as if discussing her in third person would make her less real. I heard there was an incident during the keynote. Obviously we need to understand what happened. She claims she tackled Mr. Voss to prevent an assassination attempt, Rook said. Claims she overheard you planning to sabotage the rigging. Mireya's eyebrows rose in an expression of such perfect surprise that Blythe almost admired the performance. Me, planning sabotage. She looked at Blythe with something that might have been pity if the eyes had matched the expression. That's clearly a psychiatric episode. The stress of the event, the pressure of high-profile work, some kind of paranoid break. It's not paranoid if someone actually tried to kill him, Blythe said, her voice harder now. Check Dalton's bank records. Check who paid him $50,000. Check the access logs for who was near the rigging between the original inspection and when I found the compromised cables. We will absolutely investigate everything, Mireya assured Rook, her tone warm and reasonable. But in the meantime, this woman clearly needs help. I'll arrange medical evaluation through our contractor. We have a facility that specializes in stress-related breakdowns. Very discreet, very effective. Blythe's blood went cold. Disposal doesn't mean hospital. It means I don't get to tell the truth. That's paranoid thinking, Mireya said gently. No one is trying to silence you. We're trying to help you through what's obviously a very difficult psychological crisis. Check the logs, Blythe repeated, looking at Rook instead of Mireya. Check who had access to that rigging. Check Dalton's financials. Check Mireya's phone records from tonight. I'm not having a breakdown. I'm telling you what I saw and heard. Mireya turned to Rook with professional concern. I think transfer to our medical facility is appropriate. We can't have someone this unstable wandering around making accusations. Discretion is essential, for her protection as much as the company's reputation. Transfer her to a private facility controlled by the person she's accusing? Blythe's voice rose to something close to desperation. You understand that's exactly what someone planning a cover-up would do? Rook's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression shifting from skeptical interrogator to something harder to read. Excuse me. He stepped into the hallway, phone pressed to his ear. Mireya's perfect composure flickered for just a second, a microscopic tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible tension in her jaw. Then the mask settled back into place, warm and concerned, and absolutely terrifying in its completeness. You're going to be fine, Mireya said softly, and Blythe heard the threat underneath the compassion. We'll make sure you get exactly the help you need. Rook returned, his phone still in hand, his expression carefully neutral. Site engineers just sent preliminary findings on the rigging analysis. They found industrial cable shears, used on the primary support cables. Cuts to 70% depth, timed to fail under sustained operational load. Anchor bolts loosened to precise tolerances requiring access codes and structural engineering knowledge. The room went very quiet. Mireya's face stayed perfectly composed, but something behind her eyes shifted. Calculation replacing concern, damage control replacing compassion. They also found, Rook continued, his voice flat and professional, that the inspection report filed by Dalton Cruz at 8:30 was actually created at 15:47 and backdated. Timestamp analysis confirms the document was falsified after the event setup began. Then Dalton is clearly involved in whatever sabotage occurred, Mireya said smoothly. Which is why we need to understand who he was working with. This woman, she gestured at Blythe, was the one who first identified the compromised rigging. That's suspicious timing. Or, Blythe said quietly, it's a temp worker who noticed what she wasn't supposed to notice, and ruined a very carefully planned murder. Rook's phone buzzed again. He read the message, and something in his expression cracked through the professional neutrality. He looked at Mireya, then at Blythe, then back at his phone like he was confirming something he didn't want to believe. Financial analysis just came through on Dalton's accounts. $50,000 wire transfer received this morning from a shell company registered to, he stopped, his jaw tightening, to an entity with proxy ownership traceable to Voss Logistics internal networks. Mireya's perfect composure shattered for exactly 1 second. Fear, rage, calculation all flashing across her face before the mask slammed back into place. But Blythe saw it, Rook saw it, and in that 1 second of visible panic, the truth became undeniable. "I think," Rook said carefully, "we need to continue this conversation with federal investigators present. And Miss Klein, I'm going to need you to stay in the building until they arrive." Chapter 6. The federal investigators arrived at 11:47 p.m., 2 FBI agents, with credentials, and the kind of quiet authority that came from investigating corporate fraud that destroyed lives. They'd brought forensic accountants, digital forensics specialists, and the weight of federal law enforcement backing every question they asked. Blythe sat in the same metal chair, zip ties finally removed, watching through the one-way glass as they methodically dismantled Mireya Klein's decade of careful positioning, with the precision of surgeons excising a tumor. The structural engineers presented first, their findings projected on screens that turned sabotage into undeniable mathematics. 3 primary support cables, the senior engineer explained, pointing to enlarged photographs of cable ends that looked like they'd been attacked rather than worn. Industrial shears used to cut to 70% depth. Not random damage. Precise cuts at calculated points to maintain apparent structural integrity, while guaranteeing failure under sustained operational load. The images were damning. Clean shear marks, uniform depth, the kind of precision that required knowledge and intent rather than neglect or accident. Anchor bolts loosened to exact tolerances, he continued, pulling up specifications and measurements. Not stripped or damaged through wear, manually rotated to specific positions that would allow separation under stress. This requires understanding of load calculations, stress thresholds, failure cascade patterns. "What you're describing," one of the FBI agents said carefully, "is engineering knowledge applied to create catastrophic failure disguised as negligence. What I'm describing is premeditated structural murder." The engineer's voice was flat, clinical, but his hands shook slightly as he advanced slides. The safety redundancies were manually bypassed, requires access codes, administrative privileges, deliberate manipulation of systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of failure. This wasn't missed during inspection. This was executed by someone who understood our safety protocols well enough to circumvent them. The digital forensics specialist took over, pulling up documents and timelines that told a different story than the one filed in official reports. Inspection report shows Dalton Cruz completed structural assessment at 8:30, signed off all systems as secure. She highlighted metadata that glowed accusatory on the screen. But timestamp analysis of the digital file reveals creation at 15:47, nearly 4 hours after the event setup began, almost 8 hours after the purported inspection time. This report was backdated to create false documentation of safety compliance. Security footage played next, grainy but clear enough to show Mireya Klein accessing the rigging platform at 15:47, moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone executing a practiced plan. 43 minutes on the platform. No legitimate reason for head of operations to be personally inspecting rigging after certified contractors had already signed off. More footage. Dalton Cruz at 14:15, accepting a manila envelope from a woman identified as Mireya's executive assistant. The exchange lasted 11 seconds. No conversation. Just transfer of materials and Dalton walking away, checking the contents with the furtive glance of someone receiving payment for services rendered. The forensic accountant presented financial records with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found proof of exactly what they'd suspected. Dalton Cruz received a $50,000 wire transfer this morning at 9:23 from a shell company registered in Delaware. That shell company's ownership traces through 2 holding corporations back to an entity, with proxy board representation tied to Voss Logistics' internal networks. She pulled up corporate structure diagrams that looked like spiderwebs, shell companies owning shell companies, proxy votes accumulated across a decade, voting shares positioned with the patient precision of someone building toward a specific endgame. Mireya Klein has, over the past 10 years, established control of 12 shell corporations holding cumulative voting rights, representing approximately 42% of Voss Logistics board authority. These entities vote as a block on all major decisions. In the event of CEO death or incapacitation, board succession protocols would transfer executive authority to operations, Mireya's current position, pending permanent replacement vote. So if Voss died tonight, the FBI agent said, Mireya would assume interim CEO authority. And with 42% voting block plus 3 confirmed proxy board members, she'd have majority control to make that interim position permanent. The accountant's voice carried grim satisfaction. This wasn't just assassination. This was a decade-long corporate coup, with murder as the final execution step. Rook had been silent through most of the presentation, but now he spoke, his voice carrying something that might have been self-recrimination. And we almost dismissed the only person who saw the truth. almost let Maria transfer Miss Calderon to a private facility where she would have disappeared. Blythe finished quietly. That's what disposal means. Not hospital. Not treatment. Just elimination of the witness who ruined 10 years of careful planning. The FBI agents looked at her with new assessment. Not temp worker or potential conspirator, but the person whose observation and courage had prevented corporate murder disguised as negligence. Ms. Calderon, the lead agent said, we're going to need detailed testimony about everything you observed tonight. The overheard conversation, the rigging inspection, the timing of events. You're the primary witness to attempted murder and corporate conspiracy. Before Blythe could respond, Rook's radio crackled. We have Maria Klein in custody, bringing her to federal holding. The interrogation room door opened. 2 FBI agents led Maria in, her hands zip-tied, her perfect composure finally shattered. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of evidence that had dismantled her decade of positioning in less than 3 hours. Her eyes found Blythe through the one-way glass, pure hatred, barely contained. Maria Klein, the lead FBI agent said formally, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, corporate fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent. I built this company, Maria interrupted, her voice raw with fury. 10 years. 10 years of strategic positioning, of making this organization efficient, of turning Voss Logistics into the model everyone else follows. And one temp worker, she looked at Blythe again. One invisible nobody, ruins everything, because she couldn't mind her own business. One temp worker, Rook said quietly, who saved a man's life by trusting her expertise over your fraudulent inspection reports. One temp worker, who saw the truth when everyone with credentials was too busy reading paperwork to notice the physical evidence. The evidence doesn't lie, the structural engineer added, his voice carrying professional finality. The cables were deliberately cut. The bolts were deliberately loosened. The safety systems were deliberately bypassed. She saved his life. You tried to take it. Mireya laughed once, bitter and disbelieving. You're treating her like a hero. She's a temp worker who makes $400 a night and lives in a studio apartment with a dying sister. She's nobody. She's the person who stopped you, Blythe said, standing up for the first time, her legs shaky but her voice steady. She's the person you underestimated because you spent 10 years seeing workers as obstacles instead of humans with expertise. And that underestimation cost you everything. The FBI agents led Mireya away, her protests fading as they moved her to federal holding. Through the security office window, Blythe watched SFPD vehicles and federal cars filling the parking lot, watched investigators cataloging evidence, watched the machinery of justice processing a crime that had almost succeeded because the person who noticed it was considered too invisible to matter. Rook approached her carefully, as if she might be fragile despite the steel core she'd just demonstrated. Ms. Calderon, I owe you an apology. We almost. He stopped, started again. You were right. About everything. And we almost killed the only person who saw the truth. You didn't know, Blythe said, exhaustion finally catching up with adrenaline. You were doing your job. I'm just someone who works with equipment every day and knows what normal wear patterns look like. You are someone who trusted your expertise over credentials and authority. Someone who had the courage to speak truth when everyone told you to stay quiet. He held out her phone, her work radio, her confiscated equipment. You saved Harlan Voss's life twice tonight. That makes you considerably more than just anything. Through the window, Blythe saw Voss himself arriving, escorted by additional security, his suit still torn from when she'd tackled him off the stage. He caught her eye through the glass and nodded once, acknowledgement, gratitude, recognition. For the first time in 7 years of being invisible, Blythe Calderon was seen. And somewhere in the evidence bags and forensic reports, and federal charges being filed, the message was clear. Expertise didn't require credentials, truth didn't require authority, and sometimes, the most important voice in the room belonged to the person everyone had trained themselves not to see. The temp worker who noticed what she wasn't supposed to notice, the invisible woman who just dismantled a decade of patient corporate murder, with nothing but observation and conscience. The nobody who'd proven that seeing the truth and speaking it was the rarest kind of courage that existed. Chapter 7. The federal investigation consumed the next 72 hours like a controlled demolition, methodical, thorough, revealing structural rot that had been hidden beneath a facade of corporate efficiency for a decade. Blythe sat in a FBI conference room on the third day, watching forensic accountants present findings that transformed Mireya Klein from attempted murderer into architect of systematic corporate fraud so elaborate it had its own organizational chart. 47 fraudulent logistics contracts over 8 years, the lead forensic accountant explained, pulling up spreadsheets that told stories of money vanishing into carefully constructed holes. Total embezzlement approximately $40 million through phantom shipping routes, falsified cargo manifests, and systematically inflated operational costs. The screen filled with shipping manifests that documented cargo that never existed, routes that were never traveled, fuel costs for vessels that sat idle. Each fraudulent entry was small enough to avoid triggering audit protocols. $80,000 here, $120,000 there, amounts that looked reasonable in an organization moving billions in annual revenue. The genius of it, the accountant continued with grudging professional admiration, is that every fraudulent transaction had perfect supporting documentation. Bills of lading, customs clearances, fuel receipts, port fees, all falsified but internally consistent. Anyone auditing the paperwork would find everything in order. Because I trusted the paperwork, Voss said quietly from his position at the head of the table. He'd been present for every briefing, watching his most efficient executive's decade of betrayal unfold in spreadsheets and evidence logs. I built systems to ensure accountability through documentation. She understood those systems well enough to forge documents that satisfied every protocol. The corporate structure analyst took over, projecting the shell company network that looked like a diagram of money laundering, designed by someone with advanced business degrees and sociopathic patience. 12 shell corporations established over 10 years, each registered in different states with different ownership structures. But trace them back through holding companies and proxy arrangements, and they all lead to the same beneficial owner. She highlighted connections that glowed red on the screen. Maria Klein, using various legal entities and nominee directors to hide her accumulation of voting shares. How much control did she have? One of the FBI agents asked. 42% of board voting authority, plus 7 proxy board members, individuals she'd installed over the years through strategic recommendations and political maneuvering within corporate governance structures. With those proxies, she controlled 58% of board votes. The analyst's voice carried the weight of someone explaining how democracy could be quietly stolen through parliamentary procedure. In the event of CEO death or incapacitation, board succession protocols transfer executive authority to the next ranking officer, in this case, head of operations, pending permanent replacement vote, which she would win, Voss said, using her majority voting bloc to make herself permanent CEO. Within 6 months of your death, she would have had absolute control. The assassination wasn't impulsive violence. It was the final step in a decade-long hostile takeover disguised as loyal service. The facility's safety investigator presented next, and his findings carried a different kind of horror. Not financial fraud, but systemic negligence that endangered lives. 12 port facilities across the West Coast showing evidence of falsified safety reports over the past 6 years. Structural inspections signed off by certified engineers who, when contacted, have no record of conducting those inspections. Their credentials were used without authorization to create fraudulent documentation. Photographs filled the screen, corroded support beams, compromised electrical systems, rigging equipment showing stress damage that should have triggered immediate replacement. All documented as inspected and secure by engineers who'd never set foot in the facilities. We're estimating over 2,000 workers operated in environments with systemic safety failures that were deliberately hidden through falsified documentation. The investigator's voice was tight, with controlled anger. This isn't just financial fraud. This is reckless endangerment on a scale that could have resulted in mass casualties. Blythe thought of the rigging she'd inspected, the loosened bolts and fraying cables that had almost killed Voss. Thought of 12 facilities full of workers who trusted that someone was checking the equipment, ensuring the structures were sound, maintaining the systems that kept them alive. Workers like her, invisible people who did the actual work while executives reviewed paperwork that said everything was fine. She created a corporate culture where documentation mattered more than physical reality, Voss said, and Blythe heard something break in his voice. I built systems to ensure accountability, and she weaponized those systems to hide negligence and fraud because she knew I'd trust the paperwork over ground-level observation. He looked at Blythe across the conference table. You saw in seconds what I missed for years, because you look at the actual equipment instead of the reports that say the equipment is fine. I'm a temp worker, Blythe said quietly. If I trust paperwork over physical evidence, I get hurt. People like me don't have the luxury of assuming systems work just because documentation says they do. The FBI lead agent reviewed the charges being filed. Attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, corporate fraud, embezzlement, racketeering, reckless endangerment, falsification of safety reports, conspiracy to commit securities fraud. The list continued for 2 full pages. Dalton Cruz has already pled guilty to accessory to attempted murder and falsification of inspection reports in exchange for cooperation, the agent added. He's providing testimony about Maria's instructions, the payment structure, and the systematic falsification of safety documentation across multiple facilities. What about the workers? Blythe asked, the question surprising her as much as everyone else in the room. The 2,000 people who've been operating in facilities with hidden safety failures. What happens to them? The agent and Voss exchanged glances. all hidden beneath documentation that looked perfect to anyone who trusted systems over people. "Ms. Calderon," Voss said, and his voice carried a weight that made her look up. "You exposed a 10-year conspiracy by trusting what you saw over what the paperwork claimed. You saved my life twice. You potentially saved hundreds of workers from operating in facilities that could have collapsed. And you did it all while making $400 for a 12-hour shift." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I'd like to offer you a position. Not temp work, not gratitude charity. A real position with real authority to fix what's broken." And Blythe, exhausted and overwhelmed and still worried about Thea's medication costs, realized that being invisible was over, for better or worse, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person could do was simply tell the truth when everyone around them had trained themselves to trust lies disguised as documentation. Chapter 8. 3 days after federal agents arrested Maria Klein, Blythe woke up in a private room at UCSF Medical Center, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The last clear recollection was sitting in the FBI conference room at 2 a.m., giving testimony about overheard phone calls and loosened bolts, while trying not to fall asleep mid-sentence. A nurse, actual medical professional, not the overworked residents who staffed the ER where Blythe usually took Thea, checked her vitals with practiced efficiency. "You collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration about 18 hours ago. Mr. Voss had you brought here. You've been sleeping ever since. Thea, my sister, is being cared for at the pediatric specialty unit 2 floors up. Pulmonology team is evaluating her for advanced treatment options." The nurse's smile was genuine. Mr. Voss arranged everything. Top specialists, full insurance coverage, experimental therapies, if she qualifies. Blythe tried to process that information through the fog of too much sleep and not enough. Voss had paid for Thea's care. Complete care. The kind of care that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and required insurance Blythe hadn't had in 18 months. "How much does that cost?" Her voice came out rough. "Not your concern anymore, apparently." The nurse handed her a folder. "Mr. Voss would like to meet with you when you're feeling up to it. He's been waiting in the consulting room since 6 a.m. The meeting room overlooked the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows, comfortable furniture, coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of burnt regret. Voss stood when she entered, his expression carefully neutral in the way of executives who'd practiced controlling their faces through difficult conversations. "Miss Calderon. Thank you for agreeing to meet." He gestured to a chair. "How are you feeling?" "Like I just found out a billionaire paid for my sister's medical care, without asking if I wanted charity." Blythe sat, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing. Consider it part of your benefits package." He pulled out a tablet, pulled up what looked like an employment contract. "I'd like to offer you a position with Voss Logistics. Head of Corporate Relations, $85,000 per year, full benefits, relocation assistance if needed." Blythe scanned the contract, her temp worker survival instincts immediately recognizing what this was. "That's a PR title. Corporate Relations means I smile for photographers and tell feel-good stories about how the invisible temp worker saved the CEO's life. You're making me the company's redemption narrative." Voss's carefully neutral expression flickered with surprise. "You just turned down more money than you make in 2 years. Because it's gratitude, not authority." Blythe pushed the tablet back across the table. "I don't need rescue. I need power to fix what's actually broken." "What do you mean?" "I mean your systems failed because no one listened to workers on the ground. Mireya spent 10 years hiding fraud and negligence because you trusted documentation over physical reality." Blythe's voice was steady despite her exhaustion. "I see things you can't because I live in the machinery you design. I know what normal wear looks like because my life depends on noticing when equipment is compromised. Your inspectors read paperwork. I read reality." Voss was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made Blythe want to look away but refuse to. "What would you want instead?" he asked finally. "Director of Ethics and Safety. Real authority to implement safety protocols based on ground-level worker input. Veto power over any contract or decision that endangers workers. Direct reporting to you, not filtered through corporate hierarchy." Blythe leaned forward. "I want the power to prevent what almost happened to you from happening to the 2,000 workers operating in facilities Mireya compromised. I want authority to make sure temp workers and dock laborers and equipment coordinators get heard when they say something feels wrong." "That's unprecedented." "Giving a temp worker, former temp worker," Blythe interrupted. "And unprecedented is exactly what you need. Because your precedented systems almost got you killed and endangered thousands of workers. Maybe it's time to try trusting expertise over credentials." Voss pulled the tablet back, began typing. "Director of Ethics and Safety. $120,000 per year. Full authority to implement and enforce safety protocols across all facilities. Mandatory ground-level worker input before any safety inspection is approved. Veto power over contracts that pose worker safety risks. Direct report to CEO. He looked up. You report to me. You have full access to facilities, inspections, contracts. You can override any decision you believe endangers workers. Does that meet your requirements? Blythe read the modified contract carefully, looking for the catch, the fine print that would turn authority into performance. But it was straightforward. Real power, real responsibility, earned through competence rather than given through gratitude. Yes, she said. That meets my requirements. Then welcome to Voss Logistics, Director Calderon. Voss extended his hand. I'm hiring you because you saved my life, by trusting your expertise. I expect you to continue trusting that expertise, even when it makes me uncomfortable. Blythe shook his hand, feeling the weight of real employment for the first time in 7 years. Not temp work, not invisible labor paid in cash, at shift completion. Actual career with authority and expectation, that her knowledge mattered. Your sister's medical care is covered regardless of whether you accept this position, Voss added. That's not conditional. That's basic human decency for someone who saved my life. Thank you. Blythe's throat tightened. For Thea, for giving me a chance to actually fix things instead of just being the feel-good story. I'm not giving you a chance. I'm hiring expertise I should have valued years ago. Voss stood, gathering his materials. Your first assignment is reviewing safety protocols at our Oakland facility. I want ground-level worker interviews, physical inspections, comparison between documentation and reality. Due in 2 weeks. As he moved toward the door, Blythe called after him. Why are you really doing this? It's not just gratitude. Voss turned back, and for the first time she saw something vulnerable in his expression. Because Mireya was right about one thing. I trusted systems over people. I believed that if the paperwork was perfect, reality must match. And that blind faith in documentation almost killed me, and endangered thousands of workers. He paused. You see what I miss. You understand what I never could, because you live in the world I only read reports about. I need that perspective, not as token diversity hire, as actual leadership, that prevents disasters before they happen. After he left, Blythe sat in the consulting room looking out at the city, the same Oakland she'd struggled to survive in, now viewed from a corporate medical facility paid for by a CEO, who'd learned that sometimes the most valuable expertise came from the people systems trained everyone to ignore. 2 floors up, Thea was receiving care that would have been impossible a week ago. In 2 weeks, Blythe would be reviewing safety protocols with actual authority to change them. And somewhere in Federal Holding, Mireya Klein was realizing that underestimating the invisible temp worker had cost her everything she'd spent a decade building. Blythe pulled out her phone and texted Thea, "Everything's going to be okay. Real job, real insurance, real chance to make things better." The response came back immediately. "I told you corporate people don't see us as human. Guess one of them finally learned." Blythe smiled despite her exhaustion. Maybe she'd just proven that being invisible only worked until someone refused to stay quiet about the truth everyone else had trained themselves not to see. Either way, the temp worker who noticed loosened bolts had just become the director who'd make sure no one ever had to risk their life by trusting fraudulent paperwork again. And that felt like the kind of authority worth demanding, instead of accepting as charity disguised as gratitude. Chapter 9. Blythe's first day as Director of Ethics and Safety began at 6 a.m., in a Port of Oakland warehouse that smelled of diesel fuel, salt water, and decades of sweat. She wore steel-toe boots, the same scuffed pair from the gala, and a reflective safety vest over her business casual clothes. The workers loading containers onto trucks watched her with undisguised suspicion. "Corporate's here to check boxes," one man muttered to his crew. "Give it 2 weeks before she's back in her office pretending we don't exist." Blythe approached him directly. "I'm Blythe Calderon. I worked temp logistics for 7 years before this. What's the biggest safety issue no one's addressing?" The man blinked, caught off guard. "You serious?" "Dead serious. I've got authority to fix things. But I need to know what's actually broken." Over the next 3 months, Blythe reviewed safety protocols across all 6 Voss Logistics facilities. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Inspection reports signed by managers who'd never set foot on the floor. Structural assessments completed from photographs. Safety compliance checks based on paperwork, not reality. "This is how Mireya operated for 10 years, she told Voss during their weekly meeting. The system trusted documentation over observation. As long as the forms were signed, no one looked deeper. She implemented a new protocol. Mandatory ground-level worker input before any safety sign-off. Forklift operators had to approve brake systems. Crane technicians had to inspect rigging personally. Loading crews had to verify weight distribution before anyone signed paperwork. The pushback was immediate. "Corporate never listens to us," a crane operator told her flatly during a facility visit. Why should we waste time reporting problems when nothing changes? Blythe met his eyes. Because I am corporate now. And I'm listening. Test me. Report something you've been complaining about for months. He did. Frayed cables on Crane 7. Documented in worker logs for 18 months. Ignored by management because replacement wasn't budgeted until next quarter. Blythe shut down Crane 7 that afternoon. Replacement cables arrived within 48 hours. Word spread fast. Within 6 weeks, her anonymous reporting system logged 247 safety concerns. Blythe investigated every single one. She identified 14 critical failures that had been missed by paperwork-based inspections. Corroded support beams, malfunctioning emergency shutoffs, improperly stored hazardous materials, outdated fire suppression systems. 3 of those failures would have caused major accidents within weeks. The loading dock incident at Facility 3. A worker reported that hydraulic lifts were stuttering during operation. Inspection revealed catastrophic pressure valve failure. Would have dropped a 6-ton container onto the crew below within days. Cost to fix, $12,000. Cost of accident, 4 lives, $3 million in damages. Federal investigation. The warehouse fire at Facility 5. Night janitor mentioned chemical smell near storage area. Investigation found improperly labeled containers leaking reactive compounds. Would have ignited during next heatwave. Cost to fix, $8,000 in proper storage and ventilation. Cost to fire, entire facility, 150 jobs, $5 million in losses. The structural collapse at Port Terminal 2. Dock worker noticed weird vibrations when heavy trucks crossed elevated platform. Engineering analysis revealed stress fractures in support columns. Catastrophic failure imminent. Cost to fix, $200,000 in reinforcement. Cost of collapse, 30+ casualties. Criminal negligence charges. Company destroyed. Total cost savings from prevented accidents, $8.2 million. Total jobs saved through early intervention, 200+. Harlan Voss reviewed the quarterly report in silence, then looked at Blythe across his desk. Efficiency is up 15%. Worker satisfaction up 40%. Accident rate down 73%. He paused. How? The people doing the work know more than the people writing the reports. Blythe said simply. You just have to actually listen to them. Voss nodded slowly, and something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude, but genuine professional respect. I've been running this company for 20 years. I thought systems created accountability. You're proving that people create accountability. Systems just document it. Their partnership evolved into something neither had expected. Collaboration between strategic vision and ground-level reality. No romance. No rescue dynamic. Just 2 professionals discovering that combining executive authority with working-class expertise produced better results than either could achieve alone. Blythe established safety bonus programs, mandatory training using real incident scenarios, and quarterly worker councils where floor-level employees presented directly to executive leadership. Corporate culture began to shift. Credentials mattered less than expertise. Titles mattered less than results. The temp worker who'd saved the CEO's life was now transforming how the entire company valued human knowledge over paperwork. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, Blythe was reviewing routine maintenance logs when something made her stop. Warehouse 4, forklift brake inspection. Signed off by Marcus Riley, certified mechanic. Dated 3 days ago. She pulled personnel records. Marcus Riley had died 2 months earlier. Cancer. Someone was forging a dead man's signature. Blythe's hands went cold. She grabbed her phone and called Rook Ellison, now head of corporate security. Evacuate Warehouse 4. Right now. Don't ask questions. Blythe. I need a reason. The mechanic who signed off on the forklift brakes has been dead for 2 months. Someone's covering up sabotage. Get everyone out, now. Rook trusted her this time. Emergency evacuation ordered. 37 workers cleared the facility in 6 minutes, confused, and some angry about lost shift pay. Inspection teams found it. Brake lines corroded with industrial acid. Hydraulic system failure imminent. 8 minutes from catastrophic collapse that would have dropped loaded pallets, crushed workers beneath falling cargo, caused chain reaction structural failure. Projected casualties, 8 dead, 20 injured. Evidence traced back through encrypted communications to an accomplice working with Mireya Klein, still orchestrating revenge from jail. As federal agents arrested the accomplice and revoked Mireya's bail, the warehouse workers gathered outside, understanding slowly dawning that the woman they'd been skeptical about had just saved their lives. One of them, the crane operator who'd tested her months earlier, approached Blythe. You really are listening. Always, she said. That's the job. Because expertise wasn't about titles or credentials or corporate hierarchy. It was about seeing what was real and having the courage to act on it, Even when systems designed to ignore you said you were nobody. Blythe Calderon had been nobody once. Now she was the person who made sure nobody stayed invisible ever again. Chapter 10. Warehouse 4 operated on skeleton crew during night shift. 30 workers managing automated systems that moved hundreds of tons of cargo through the Port of Oakland's most advanced facility. Robotic forklifts transported pallets stacked 20 feet high. Overhead cranes shuttled containers between storage racks and loading bays. The entire operation choreographed with precision timing, where a single failure could cascade into catastrophe. Blythe sat at her kitchen table at 11 p.m., laptop open, reviewing the week's routine maintenance logs while Thea did homework across from her. It was tedious work. Dozens of inspections, hundreds of signatures, the kind of paperwork most executives delegated to assistants. But Blythe had learned that the devil lived in details everyone else ignored. She scrolled through Warehouse 4's automated forklift system logs. Brake inspection completed Tuesday at 14:30. Hydraulic pressure verified. Safety protocols confirmed. Signed by Marcus Riley, certified mechanic, employee ID number 4721. Something about the name triggered recognition. She'd seen it recently in a different context. Blythe opened personnel records and searched. Marcus Riley. Status: deceased. Date of death: September 3rd. Cause: pancreatic cancer. 2 months ago. She checked the inspection signature again. Dated 3 days ago. Someone was forging a dead mechanic's name to certify equipment as safe. Blythe's blood went ice cold. She grabbed her phone and called Rook Ellison. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. Rook, evacuate Warehouse 4. Right now. Full emergency shutdown. Don't ask questions. Blythe, I need a reason to pull 30 workers off a functioning shift. The mechanic who signed off on the forklift brake systems died 2 months ago from cancer. Someone's forging his signature to cover up sabotage. Get everyone out. Now. The line went silent for 2 seconds. Then, initiating emergency evacuation. Rook had learned to trust her instincts. The first time she'd been right, it saved Harlan Voss's life. The second time, she'd stopped warehouse sabotage. He wasn't going to doubt her a third time. Emergency alarms blared through Warehouse 4. Automated systems shut down mid-operation. Workers abandoned stations and headed for exits. Confused. Some angry about losing shift pay and production bonuses. What the hell is corporate playing at now? One forklift operator complained as they gathered in the parking lot. Probably another drill, someone else muttered. Wasting our time because some exec wants to feel important. Blythe arrived 20 minutes later with Rook and a specialized inspection team. They went straight to the automated forklift fleet. 12 heavy-duty machines capable of moving 10-ton loads. What they found made even the veteran mechanics go pale. The brake lines on all 12 forklifts had been systematically corroded with industrial-grade acid. The compound was designed to weaken gradually, invisible to casual inspection. Catastrophic underload. Hydraulic pressure analysis showed imminent failure. The first system would have collapsed in 12 minutes, right at the peak of the night shift's heaviest cargo transfer. The trajectory team ran simulations. First forklift failure would drop a loaded pallet from 20 feet, crushing anyone in the immediate area. The impact would destabilize surrounding stacks, causing chain reaction collapse. Overhead crane operators would emergency stop their loads, but momentum would swing multi-ton containers into support columns. Projected casualties: 8 dead from falling cargo and structural impact. 23 injured from secondary collapses and debris. Warehouse structural integrity compromised, requiring months of repairs. Total damage estimate: $12 million in destroyed inventory, equipment replacement, facility reconstruction, and regulatory fines. But those were just numbers. The human cost was visible in the faces of the workers gathered outside, as inspection teams explained what would have happened if they'd stayed at their stations. 8 empty chairs at family dinner tables. 23 people in hospital beds. 37 lives changed forever, because someone wanted revenge. Who did this? The forklift operator demanded. His earlier skepticism transformed into rage. Who tried to kill us? Blythe pulled up the investigation findings on her tablet. The acid used requires specialized handling. We cross-referenced purchase records with employee access logs. The accomplice was revealed: Thomas Kelvin, a maintenance supervisor who'd been passed over for promotion when Blythe implemented her safety reforms. He'd been in contact with Maria Klein through encrypted prison communications, paid $75,000 to execute her revenge. Federal agents arrested Kelvin at his home 3 hours later. His laptop contained detailed plans. Sabotage timed to occur during Blythe's first quarterly board presentation, making it look like her reforms had destabilized operations instead of improving them. Maria's bail was immediately revoked. Additional charges filed: conspiracy to commit mass murder, attempted manslaughter, obstruction of justice. Her sentence was extended from 25 years to life, without possibility of parole. The crane operator who'd first tested Blythe months ago approached her in the parking lot as dawn broke over the port. His crew stood behind him, the same workers who'd been skeptical when corporate sent another executive to fix things. "You saved our lives," he said simply. Third time someone from corporate actually kept us safe, instead of just talking about it. Second time was the warehouse fire, another worker added. First time was when you shut down Crane 7 for the frayed cables. Blythe shook her head. "You saved your own lives. You're the ones who report problems through the system. I just listen and act on what you already know." "Most corporate never listens," the crane operator said. "That's what makes you different." As the workers headed home to families they'd almost never seen again, Thea texted Blythe. "News is covering the warehouse evacuation. They're calling you a hero again." Blythe typed back, "Not a hero. Just someone who checks if the mechanic signing paperwork is still breathing." Because that was the lesson Mireya Klein never learned. You can forge signatures, falsify reports, manipulate systems. But you can't fake caring enough to verify that the person certifying safety is actually alive. And in a world where paperwork often mattered more than people, that simple act of verification, checking if Marcus Riley was still alive to sign his name, was the difference between 37 workers going home safe and 8 families planning funerals. The people doing the work knew the truth. Blythe just made sure someone with authority was finally listening. Chapter 11. The federal courthouse in San Francisco was packed for the verdict. Mireya Klein sat at the defense table in a gray suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral. But her hands, folded on the polished wood, trembled slightly, the only crack in a facade she'd maintained through 8 weeks of testimony. The jury foreman stood. On the count of attempted murder, guilty. On the count of embezzlement, guilty. On the count of corporate fraud, guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit mass murder, guilty. Guilty, on all 17 counts. The judge's voice was measured, final. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole, to be served in a federal maximum security facility. As the bailiff approached to take her into custody, Mireya turned in her seat. Her eyes found Blythe in the gallery, the woman who destroyed a decade of meticulous planning, with one desperate shove across a stage. "You're still nobody," Mireya said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Blythe met her gaze without flinching. "Maybe, but I'm nobody who tells the truth." Federal marshals led Mireya away. She didn't look back. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Blythe gave no interviews. She walked to the BART station and took the train back to Oakland. Back to the office where real work waited. Back to the systems that still needed fixing. 1 year passed. The transformation was measurable in ways that mattered. 200+ jobs saved through early safety interventions. 3 major accidents prevented through worker-reported observations. Worker satisfaction increased 40% as floor-level employees gained real authority to flag problems. And remarkably, efficiency increased 15%, proof that safety and productivity weren't opposing forces, but complementary ones. Voss Logistics became the industry model for ethical corporate operations. Other port facilities sent representatives to study their protocols. The mandatory ground-level worker input requirement was adopted across West Coast logistics operations. Insurance companies offered premium discounts to companies implementing Blythe's safety frameworks. The changes rippled outward in ways she never expected. At home, Thea's health had stabilized. The experimental treatment Voss's insurance covered was working. Not a cure, but management that gave her a future instead of a countdown. She'd gained weight, color returned to her face, and the terrifying midnight coughing fits became rare instead of routine. They lived in a real apartment now. 2 bedrooms in a safer Oakland neighborhood, with heat that worked, windows that sealed, and a kitchen where Blythe could actually cook instead of microwaving whatever was cheapest. Medical debt, 0. Collections calls, silent. The suffocating weight of poverty, lifted enough to breathe. Thea sat at the kitchen table one evening, college brochures spread before her. "I'm thinking public health," she said. "Someone has to keep fighting for people who can't afford to get sick." Blythe looked at her sister, 16 years old, planning a future that had seemed impossible a year ago, and felt something close to peace. The congressional testimony came in month 13. Blythe stood before the Senate Committee on Labor and Workplace Safety, a room full of politicians who'd spent careers debating policy from positions of theoretical distance. "Safety isn't a cost," she told them, her voice steady. "It's the foundation of sustainable efficiency. When workers feel valued and heard, when they have real authority to flag problems, productivity increases. Not despite safety protocols, but because of them." She presented data, Comparison studies between companies with worker input requirements versus traditional top-down inspection models. The results were undeniable. Companies that listened to floor-level expertise had 60% fewer serious injuries, 35% lower insurance costs, and 18% higher long-term profitability. The problem isn't that workers don't see safety issues, Blythe explained. It's that corporate structures are designed to ignore them. The crane operator knows the cable is fraying. The forklift driver feels the brake stutter. The dock worker notices the vibration in the support column. But if reporting those observations means nothing changes, why waste time documenting problems no one will fix? Senator Patricia Chen leaned forward. Ms. Calderon, you're proposing mandatory worker representation in corporate safety oversight. Some business groups claim this would create regulatory burden and reduce competitiveness. Senator, I prevented 3 major accidents by listening to workers who'd been filing reports for months. Those accidents would have cost $8.2 million in damages, destroyed 200-plus jobs, and resulted in federal investigations that would have shut down operations entirely. The regulatory burden of listening saved the company and protected workers. That's not anti-competitive. That's smart business. The legislation that eventually passed, the Worker Safety Input Act, required all companies with more than 100 employees to implement formal ground-level expertise programs, anonymous reporting systems, mandatory investigation protocols, worker safety councils, with authority to halt operations pending review. It wasn't perfect. Implementation varied. Some companies treated it as box checking, but others, inspired by Voss Logistics' results, embraced the cultural shift. Working class expertise was transforming how corporate power operated, one facility at a time. Blythe returned to Oakland after the testimony and went straight to Warehouse 4, where the night shift was starting. The same workers who'd been evacuated a year ago were back at their stations, operating equipment maintained under protocols they'd helped design. The crane operator who'd tested her first saw her arrive. "Corporate's here," he announced, but this time there was no suspicion in his voice. "Blythe, the hydraulic system on Dock 7 is making that sound again." "Same sound as last time, or different?" "Different. Higher pitch. Started yesterday. Shut down Dock 7. I'll get maintenance out here within the hour." He nodded and made the call. No argument. No skepticism. Just trust, built through a year of proving that reporting problems led to solutions, not punishment. As Blythe walked through the warehouse, past workers who nodded acknowledgement instead of looking away, past systems redesigned with their input, past a culture transformed from fear to partnership, she thought about Maria's final words. "You're still nobody." Maybe that was true. She'd never have the credentials that corporate America traditionally valued, never have the Ivy League degree, or the executive pedigree, or the family connections that opened doors. But she had something more valuable. She knew what broken looked like from the inside. She understood that the people operating the machinery knew more about its failures than the people writing reports about it. She'd learned that expertise came from experience, not credentials. And she'd proven that nobody who tells the truth can change everything. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone overlooked. Sometimes transformation comes from the bottom up, and sometimes courage means speaking truth when silence would be easier, when staying invisible would be safer. Blythe Calderon had been invisible once. Now she was the standard by which corporate accountability was measured, and that was more than enough. Chapter 12. The Voss Logistics boardroom occupied the 42nd floor of a downtown Oakland tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the port facilities that generated billions in annual revenue. 12 directors sat around the polished conference table, venture capitalists, industry veterans, former government officials, people whose combined net worth could buy small countries. Blythe stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit she'd bought specifically for this presentation, her steel-toe boots replaced with professional heels that pinched her feet. The directors watched her with expressions ranging from polite interest to barely concealed skepticism. "Ms. Calderon," Director Patricia Hendricks began, her tone carefully neutral, "your meteoric rise from temporary equipment coordinator to VP candidate is unprecedented. Some board members have expressed concern about whether 18 months in corporate leadership constitutes sufficient experience for this level of responsibility. Translation: you're a temp worker playing dress-up in the executive suite." Blythe met her eyes without flinching. "Director Hendricks, I've worked in logistics for 9 years, 7 of those years coordinating equipment, managing schedules, and solving problems that executives never saw because they were too busy reading reports to visit facilities. I have more operational experience than most people in this room." She advanced the presentation slide. "In 18 months as Director of Ethics and Safety, I've implemented programs that saved 200-plus jobs, prevented 3 major accidents with combined damage estimates of $8.2 million, and increased both worker satisfaction and operational efficiency. Our insurance premiums dropped 23% because our incident rate is now the lowest in the industry. 6 competing port facilities have adopted our protocols. The federal government based new legislation on our worker input framework. Next slide. Comparative analysis showing Voss Logistics outperforming every competitor in safety, efficiency, and worker retention. I didn't accomplish this through credentials or connections. I accomplished it by listening to the people who actually operate our systems and acting on what they already knew. That's not unprecedented. That's competence. Director Marcus Zhu leaned forward. The board recognizes your contributions, but VP of Operations oversees strategic planning, contract negotiations, facility expansion, responsibilities that require understanding how operations actually function, Blythe interrupted. Not just how they look on spreadsheets. I can tell you which cranes are overworked before the maintenance logs show stress fractures. I can identify which routes are inefficient because I've watched loading crews compensate for poor logistics planning. I know which safety protocols look good on paper, but create dangerous workarounds in practice. She paused, letting that sink in. You're right that I don't have an MBA from Stanford, but I have something more valuable. I know the difference between what reports say and what's actually happening. And in an industry where the gap between those two things can cost lives, that expertise matters. The board exchanged glances. Director Hendricks reviewed the financial projections. The metrics are impressive. They're not impressive, Blythe corrected quietly. They're the baseline of what's possible when you value people's expertise over paperwork. Harlan Voss, who'd remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. The board asked me to recommend someone for VP of Operations. I'm recommending Ms. Calderon not because she saved my life, though she did, and not because I feel obligated to promote her, though some of you clearly think that's my motivation. He stood, walking to the window, overlooking the port. I'm recommending her because she sees what I miss. She understands what I never could, that the people doing the work know the truth the reports hide. I need that perspective, at the executive level, not as a token gesture, not as a feel-good story, but as a partner whose expertise makes this company better. He turned back to the board. Credentials get you in the room. Results keep you there. Ms. Calderon's results speak for themselves. The vote was called. 12 hands rose in unanimous approval. Blythe was now Vice President of Operations, Voss Logistics. After the meeting, as directors filed out, Voss approached her. You didn't need me to defend you. Your presentation did that. I know, Blythe said. But thank you anyway. This isn't gratitude, Voss clarified. This is recognition of competence. You've earned this position through measurable results. I expect you to continue challenging my assumptions and telling me when strategic plans ignore operational reality. That's the job I signed up for. They stood at the window, looking down at the port facilities stretching toward the bay. A massive infrastructure of cranes, warehouses, shipping containers, and thousands of workers whose expertise had been ignored for decades until someone finally started listening. In the visitors' gallery, Thea watched her sister become a corporate executive. 16 years old, college applications completed, future secured by the same experimental treatment her sister's new position made possible. She texted, "You did it, and you didn't have to become someone else to do it." 1 week later, Blythe and Voss sat in the operations planning office reviewing expansion proposals. No romantic tension. No power dynamic. Just two professionals with complementary expertise, building something neither could create alone. The Port of Seattle proposal, Voss said, highlighting the contract. Projected timeline shows 18-month build-out. But I've learned to distrust timelines that don't account for ground-level reality. What am I missing? Blythe pulled up the facility specs. You're missing that their loading dock design requires forklifts to make 3-point turns in spaces designed for 2-point turns. That adds 45 seconds per load. Multiply that across daily operations, and your efficiency projections are off by 12%. Also, their crane specifications don't account for seismic requirements this close to a fault line. That's not just inefficiency. That's catastrophic failure waiting to happen. Voss made notes, recommendations, redesign the loading pattern, upgrade the crane foundations, and build in 8% contingency for reality versus theory. That turns this from a disaster into a competitive advantage. See? Voss smiled slightly. That's why you're here. I would have signed that contract, celebrated the expansion, and discovered the problem 6 months into construction. That's why we're partners, Blythe corrected. Your strategic vision identifies opportunities. My operational knowledge makes them sustainable. Neither works without the other. They continued reviewing proposals. Equal partners building a logistics empire that valued human expertise over paperwork, where working-class knowledge shaped executive decisions, where the person who'd once been invisible now had authority to transform an entire industry. You proved something important, Voss said as they wrapped up. Leadership isn't about credentials. It's about seeing the truth and having the courage to speak it, even when everyone tells you to stay quiet. Blythe looked out the window at the port below, where workers operated under safety protocols they'd helped design, where efficiency and protection coexisted because someone finally listened. I didn't prove it alone, she said. Every worker who reported a problem, every crew member who trusted the system enough to flag concerns, every person who refused to accept that this is how it's always been, was proof enough. She turned back to Voss. I just made sure someone with authority was finally paying attention, because that was the real transformation. Not one temp worker becoming an executive, but an entire system learning that expertise lives in the people doing the work, and leadership means listening to them. And in a world built on hierarchies that valued credentials over competence, that simple shift changed everything. Conclusion. 2 years later, Blythe stood before the Senate again, not as a witness this time, but as the architect of transformation. The Worker Safety Input Act had passed. Federal regulations now required all corporations, with 100+ employees, to include ground-level worker representation in safety oversight. The Voss logistics model became the national standard. Thea sat in the gallery, 18 years old, wearing a UC Berkeley hoodie, full scholarship, public health major. Someone has to keep fighting for people who can't afford to get sick, she'd said when the acceptance letter arrived. Blythe's testimony was brief. Systems fail when they ignore the people who operate them. For decades, corporate America dismissed working-class expertise as irrelevant. We proved that the crane operator knows structural failure before the engineer's report. The forklift driver feels brake malfunction before the inspection log. The dock worker sees danger before the safety audit. She looked at the senators watching her, some who'd championed the legislation, others who'd fought it. You don't need credentials to see the truth. You need courage to speak it when everyone tells you to stay quiet. Final image. Port of Oakland at dawn. Workers arriving for shift change, operating under protocols they helped design. The crane operator who tested Blythe years ago now trained new hires. Corporate listens here. Your expertise matters. Report problems, and they get fixed. No one invisible anymore. Sometimes the most important person in the room is the one everyone overlooks. Sometimes truth comes from the bottom up, and sometimes courage means shouting what's real, when silence would be safer. Blythe called her on proof that expertise isn't about titles. It's about seeing what's real, and refusing to pretend you don't. If this story moved you, subscribe to hear more stories of courage from unexpected places. Like this video if you believe working-class expertise deserves recognition. Share it with someone who's ever been told their observations don't matter. And tell us in the comments, have you ever seen the truth no one else wanted to hear? What did you do? Because every voice matters. Every observation counts. And sometimes the person everyone dismisses is the one who saves lives.